Since ancient times, humans have sought to protect their homes by surrounding them with high walls. They reliably protected not only from wild animals or natural disasters, but also from visits by not-so-friendly neighbors. It's no surprise that the very first cities built serious walls, the size of which only grew over time. However, the invaders were not idle either, constantly coming up with new ways to overcome the fortifications and capture the city. This confrontation reached its peak in the Middle Ages, when assaults and sieges of cities became the most important part of any military campaign. Overcoming strong and high fortress walls was not an easy task, so castles and cities were often taken by starving out the defenders through a siege. The siege of a fortress or castle could last for several months or even years. It became a serious ordeal both for the defenders and for those who were trying to capture the stronghold. In this episode, I will talk about medieval sieges and assaults, the most popular ways to overcome fortifications, and the siege engines that were used to breach walls before the advent of artillery. You will also learn what it was like to be in a besieged city, what the main problem was for its inhabitants, and how issues with water and food were solved. My name is Semyon, and I hereby open the How They Lived series. Let's get started. Assault or siege. War against fortresses has been known to humanity since time immemorial. The oldest known siege is considered to be the Siege of Bactra in 2130 BC. The earliest methods of attacking and defending fortified cities were based primarily on cunning and numerical superiority. The opponents hardly used any specialized equipment. Later, various engines for hurling projectiles, battering rams, siege towers, and other devices appeared. Штурм крепостных укреплений. Even in the time of Alexander the Great, tactical techniques were used that remained almost unchanged until the advent of firearms. As for medieval Europe, its main feature was the presence of a large number of fortified feudal castles, which played a crucial role in the military conflicts of that era. Wooden and later stone castles served both as a means for the feudal lord to maintain power over his peasants and as protection against attacks. Соседи. Sieges of fortresses were a crucial part of medieval military campaigns. Often the movements of armies were dictated by the location of cities or troops. Troops moved from one fortress to another, either to relieve them from enemy siege or, on the contrary, to lay siege to them themselves. Armies were reinforced by fortress garrisons, and if necessary, they themselves took shelter behind impregnable walls. Preparing to besiege fortresses and castles was the first step in the event of war or even the threat of hostilities. Weapons and provisions were brought into them, garrisons were reinforced, and fortifications were put in order, because usually an unprepared castle or city became easy prey for the enemy. For this very reason, enemy fortresses were often taken as quickly as possible in a sudden rush to avoid long and exhausting sieges. Frontal assaults on fortresses by a crowd, which modern cinema loves to show, were more the exception than the rule in the Middle Ages. Even a relatively small garrison could inflict very serious damage on the enemy. The attackers were shot at with bows and crossbows, doused with water and boiling oil, had stones thrown at them, and were sprinkled with hot sand. And overcoming a deep moat and then climbing a fortress wall 10 to 15 meters high was an extremely difficult task, especially since there could easily be a second wall behind the first. Of course, the attackers didn't storm the fortifications empty-handed either. To cross the moats, they used fascines, which are bundles of sticks. They climbed the walls using ladders and broke down the gates with various types of battering rams. There were even special siege towers that were rolled up to the fortress walls. Medieval chroniclers noted the high effectiveness of such structures, but they could not always be used. Despite such an impressive arsenal of siege equipment, assaulting a fortress was always extremely risky. You could lose many soldiers and still fail. Sometimes they would attempt it, for example, if they knew that the enemy army was hurrying to help the besieged. But as a rule, assaults were only one of many siege operations aimed at destroying fortifications and demoralizing the enemy. Осадная война. Formally, a siege began with the first shot from a siege engine and later from a cannon. First of all, the city was completely blockaded to deprive its inhabitants of the opportunity to replenish supplies or receive reinforcements. Anyone who tried to bring any provisions into the besieged city was treated extremely harshly. For example, during the siege of Milan in 1161, Friedrich Barbarossa ordered local residents' hands cut off for trying to bring food into the city. It should be noted that medieval sieges were primarily engineering and fortification operations. Sometimes an assault never even took place. First of all, the besiegers would begin by building their own camp near the fortress walls. Moreover, it wasn't just about setting up tents and barracks for the personnel to live in or digging latrines, but also about building rather serious fortifications in the form of ramparts, ditches, palisades, and chevaux de frise against cavalry. All this was done so that, in the event of a possible sortie, the besieged could not catch the inhabitants of the camp by surprise. It was not uncommon for a ditch to be dug around the entire besieged city or castle to completely seal in its defenders. And besides setting up the camp, it was also necessary to install siege engines, assemble ladders, make fascines and shields for protection against enemy archers. So instead of heroic assaults, the besiegers mostly spent their time tediously digging in the ground. Rarely did anyone launch an assault as a massive horde like the orcs in The Lord of the Rings. Much more often, trenches were dug toward the walls, under the cover of which they advanced, and for this purpose covered mobile galleries were used, the so-called vignes. In extreme cases, the attackers made many large wooden shields to protect themselves as much as possible from attacks from the walls. When it comes to the destruction of medieval fortifications, people usually remember various siege engines, but there was another method, undermining. The essence of it was that an underground tunnel was dug under the necessary section of the fortification. Then it was simply collapsed. The foundation of the wall or tower would settle, after which the fortifications would collapse, opening the way for the besiegers into the city. After the invention of gunpowder, mines began to be placed in the tunnels. The besieged were well aware of the danger of undermining tunnels and took measures against them. In underground rooms, they placed vessels of water so that by the ripples on the surface they could detect the presence of an undermining tunnel. The defenders of the fortresses made counter-tunnels which collapsed the enemy's tunnels. Sometimes deep underground in the semi-darkness, bloody battles would begin. Life in the besieging army's camp was, to put it mildly, joyless. Hard work, sitting in one place for many months. On top of that, all the delights of field life almost under the open sky. Centralized supply of troops in that era was poorly developed. That's why there were problems with food. During mobile warfare, medieval soldiers always found a way to rob some peasants to get themselves food. But during sieges there were difficulties with this, because after a few days there was nothing edible left in the area. The sanitary conditions for the besiegers were no less grim. However, if the siege dragged on, they often led to a real catastrophe. A large gathering of people with little understanding of hygiene very often led to outbreaks of disease, and sometimes even to full-blown epidemics. Soldiers suffered especially badly from cholera and dysentery. Armies often suffered such heavy losses that they were forced to lift sieges. In general, sieges were extremely difficult and costly. Therefore, as soon as the enemy set up camp near the fortress walls, the opposing sides would begin negotiations in order to save lives, time, and money. The garrison could comply with the besiegers' demands. In that case, they were usually allowed to leave the castle without hindrance, often even with their weapons. Sometimes the sides agreed that if the defenders did not receive help within a specified period of time, the garrison would surrender the castle to the enemy without any bloodshed. Машины смерти. There were many siege engines in the Middle Ages, and no siege took place without them. You could say that they served the function of artillery until the advent of firearms. For example, the ballista resembled a large crossbow and fired darts and small incendiary projectiles. The trebuchet was very popular, as it could hurl a stone projectile weighing 20 to 30 kilograms a distance of 200 meters. Not only stones were thrown at enemies, but also much more exotic projectiles, vessels with incendiary mixtures, the heads of executed prisoners to demoralize the defenders, or corpses to provoke epidemics in the city. For example, the great European plague epidemic of the 14th century began with an infected corpse that the Mongols catapulted into the besieged city of Kaffa. Historians argue about how effective medieval siege engines were and what they were used for. Most likely, first and foremost, they were used to destroy buildings inside the city and eliminate enemy troops. The destructive power of even the most powerful of them was clearly not enough to bring down fortress walls. Siege engines were transported to the site of the siege in disassembled form and then assembled right in front of the fortress walls. It should be noted that it wasn't only the attackers who bombarded the city fortifications with ballistae and trebuchets. The defenders responded in kind whenever possible. Quite often, real artillery duels would take place during sieges. And the besieged had the advantage here, since they knew the area well and had already calibrated their aim. For example, during the siege of Toulouse in 1218, Count de Montfort, the leader of the crusade against the Cathars, was killed by a trebuchet stone fired from inside the city. He was 200 meters away from the wall. What was life like in a besieged city? It would not be an exaggeration to say that a besieged city was one of the most dangerous places in the Middle Ages. The main goal of the attackers was to cut the fortress off from the outside world, demoralize its inhabitants, and starve them. They even specifically chose the timing for this. It was believed that the best time for a siege was the middle of summer. The new harvest was not yet ready, and the old supplies had already been seriously depleted. Before any siege, people in the castle or city tried to stock up as much as possible and, if possible, reduce the number of mouths to feed. But this did not always help, especially if the siege dragged on. After some time, the besieged would switch to eating horse meat and then sometimes even rat meat. There are even known cases of cannibalism, although it usually didn't come to that. Much more often, the city or castle would simply surrender when its defenders ran out of provisions. For example, the grand and stubborn defense of Rochester Castle in 1215 ended when the defenders ran out of provisions. After eating all the horses, they were forced to surrender. Hunger forced Faenza to surrender after an 8-month siege in 1242, and there are countless more examples like this. The problem of water could become just as acute for those under siege. Usually both castles and cities had wells. However, they could not always meet the residents' needs even for drinking water, let alone any sanitary needs. If the city or fortress took water from a river or some other body of water, the besiegers would first try to cut off that possibility. For example, by blocking the river with a dam or throwing some kind of rotting matter into the water. The lack of water made another problem of any besieged city even worse: unsanitary conditions. Medieval cities couldn't boast high standards of cleanliness to begin with. And when, because of the siege, the removal of waste stopped as well, it became a real disaster. Often in besieged fortresses, more people died from diseases than from combat, from the fighting itself. It is also important to mention the psychological state of the inhabitants of a besieged fortress. A siege that lasted for many months and sometimes even years, along with hunger, disease, and the loss of comrades, drove the defenders of the fortress into a state of true despair. Bitterness and anger sometimes took on ugly forms because there was no outlet for them. Sometimes cities surrendered simply out of despair and the garrison's plain exhaustion. Besides, the defenders understood perfectly well what would happen to them if the city or castle was eventually taken. Usually the consequences were simply horrifying. Moreover, anyone could fall victim to the victor's wrath. No distinction was made between the military and the civilian population. Instead of an epilogue. Fortresses and castles played a crucial role in the Middle Ages. In a sense, they were its symbols. However, with the advent of artillery, their significance was greatly diminished. After all, with cannons, any fortress walls could be destroyed. But most importantly, the feudal system itself, with its reliance on castles, began to fade into the past. Sieges happened later as well. They even took place in the 20th century, but these were rather rare exceptions. This type of military operation remained in the distant past, and today it is known to the general public mainly thanks to history books and movies. That's all. See you in the next episode. Bye.